Good afternoon. My name is Kim Ponzio, and I'm the chair of the SWS Webinar Committee, and I'd like to welcome you to the Society of Wetland Scientists September webinar. I want to offer a special welcome to any non-member guests we have joining us today for our quarterly free webinar. All of our webinars are complimentary to SWS members, but once a quarter we open it up to the public. So our next free quarterly webinar will be held in December. So before we get started with the presentation today, I'd like to give our guests a quick overview of what SWS is all about. Since its founding in 1980, the Society of Wetland Scientists has continued to grow with more than 3,000 members from around the world. We have a diverse membership hailing from all sectors of wetland science, including a large sector of students. We are committed to providing our members meaningful resources that promote global wetland education, conservation, restoration globally. SWS membership includes full access to the Wetlands Journal, Wetland Science and Practice trade publication, and other professional journals such as Wetlands Ecology and Management. In addition, SWS members enjoy discounted rates for the professional certification program, access to regional chapter and section activities, student programs and grants, and discounted registration at the SWS annual meeting, which this year will be up in next year will be up in Baltimore, Maryland. All of those provide members the opportunity to network with wetland professionals from around the world. So please visit our website at sws.org to learn more about becoming a member and all of our membership benefits. We are also proud to announce that this webinar has been pre-approved by the SWS Professional Certification Program, and it is applicable for continuing education credits that can be applied to your professional wetland scientist certification or renewal. We also offer participation certificates, and they're available through an automated process. This is a new development for this particular webinar. So you'll receive an email from Michelle Chosek, our SWS Managing Director, about 1 day after the webinar, and make sure you click and look in your spam email because sometimes it'll end up in the spam email. So you just click the appropriate link to get your certificate, and these participation certificates are also available for those who watch the webinar recordings, which can be found on our past webinars page. Again, my name is Kim Ponzio, and today I'm going to be your moderator. Before we get started, I also want to go over some housekeeping items. The general format for today's webinar will be 2 20-minute presentations by our speakers, followed by approximately 15 minutes for questions. So at any time during the presentation, you can just go to that questions on the questions pane. You can go to that box and type in your question. Please indicate which speaker or speakers you are addressing with your question, and I, as the moderator, will pose those questions to them at the end of their presentation. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to that recording following the webinar. And also, we ask that you fill out the evaluation survey at the end to help us plan for future events. If you'd like a copy of today's slides, you can find a PDF copy there under the handouts section or of the control pane. And if you're tech savvy, you can use hashtag SWSwebinar to tweet about today's webinar. So with the logistics out of the way, let's get started with our webinar. It's my pleasure to welcome today's presenters, Laureen Lynn and Matt Schweisberg. Laureen Lynn is a soil scientist and restoration ecologist and is a principal at Red Mountain Consulting, LLC. Laureen performs ecological restoration, tundra rehabilitation, wetland delineation and functional assessment, soil survey, and natural resources management and mining reclamation plans. She is a certified professional soil scientist and a certified ecological restoration practitioner. And as part of her work on the North Slope of Alaska, she is the chair of the federally appointed North Slope Science Initiative Science Technical Advisory Panel. Her previous work includes consulting and working for the NRCS Soil Survey and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Her early introduction to research on coastal erosion along the Beaufort Sea coast of Alaska sparked a career in which she rarely experiences heat like we have in Florida right now. Instead, she works in a parka in the months most people associate with the summer. She lives in Palmer, Alaska with her husband and dog, and nearby her 2 children, son-in-law and grandson. And our second speaker today is Matt Schweisberg. He is the principal of Wetland Strategies and Solutions, LLC, where he provides assistance to clients throughout the lower 48 United States who seek to navigate a wide range of regulatory and non-regulatory issues related to wetlands and other aquatic resources. Matt is a professional wetland scientist under the Professional Certification Program of SWS. He is a retired federal wetlands ecologist and wildlife biologist who spent over 32 years with the U.S. EPA. He has served several times as an expert witness in federal, state, and private litigation. He co-instructs a 1-week intensive course on wetland identification and delineation at Eagle Hill Institute in Maine, and he teaches courses in wetland regulation, restoration and creation, wetland ecology, and wetland identification and delineation for federal and state agencies, academic organizations, and environmental consultants. And he received his degree in wildlife management from the University of Maine. So now I'd like to hand over control to our first speaker, Laureen Lynn.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for joining today. It looks like I now have control of the screen. That's great. Thanks for joining in today. And I just want to preface that I do work from home, and hopefully I won't have an embarrassing moment like that guy on the BBC whose children barged into his office while he was trying to talk on live television. But I do apologize if there's any outside noise. So I just want to mention that so this webinar, because it's 2 pieces, myself and Matt, I'm speaking programmatically and Matt's going to speak about a project. And so, but there is a lot of overlap between the 2, and you'll see that as we move through. Okay, and just to preface, I just want to make sure that people understand, when I work on the North Slope, I am performing tundra rehabilitation, and rehabilitation does not equal restoration as a definition, a defined definition. But I will be using the terms interchangeably here within the webinar just for simplicity's sake, but just understand that they're not equivalent words. There's a difference in timescale. Rehabilitation sometimes has a longer view timescale, and that rehabilitation sets a site up on a trajectory towards recovery, which is similar to restoration, but in a different timescale. And in some of the tundra rehabilitation, we actually have a transformation of wetlands into what would be considered uplands just hydrologically because of elevation changes. So to give some context about the program that I'm going to talk about, I just wanted to show a map. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner, there's a map of Alaska with the red area outlined, which is showing just the north slope of Alaska. The blue line depicts the edge of the Brooks Range, mountain range. And you'll see where it says Prudhoe Bay and Alpine, and there's a bunch of red lines. That's the region that I will be talking about, is in the Prudhoe Bay region in particular, just below that area, that arrow. And just to know that the development in this area is spreading east and it's spreading west, and so this work is taking place in a huge range, huge area across Alaska. I also want to make sure that people understand that this program, I don't want to take full credit for the program itself. I worked on the program, I helped manage it, and I'm sharing this program as a successful example of a wetland restoration program. So this slide is showing here in the bottom, I have taken out the National Wetlands Inventory mapping of wetlands on the North Slope to compare and show that the entire North Slope, or the coastal plain region, is classified as wetland. And although there are some small upland regions on the coastal plain, it's mostly broadly classified as a wetland. And also that no soil survey has been performed for the coastal plain yet. And this just shows an aerial of just how wet it is. You can see that there's plenty of ponds and streams, and there's just water across the entire landscape. And this is mostly because of the underlying permafrost. And the underlying permafrost perches the water. It has nowhere to drain to. And because the coastal plain has such a low slope elevation, the water moves very slowly from the Brooks Range to the ocean. And so the ground stays really saturated year-round. So this is an aerial of some of the scattered development across the North Slope, just showing how there's lots of different spots. It's spread out. It's not a close-knit type of development. It's a spider network. Here I've just shown like the ones in yellow are places that are still active, and the circle in blue is a tundra rehabilitation site, a site where the gravel has been removed, and we've been doing restoration activities and monitoring there. This also, again, shows the spider network of sites across Prudhoe Bay. Each one of those symbols, the boxes, triangles, circles, and airplanes, show a different site. So there's many, many sites, and that's why this is truly a wetland restoration program, because there's so many different sites to keep track of across the whole area. I wanted to give some background on the restoration work in Prudhoe Bay and the surrounding area. So the 1950s was when the earliest oil exploration began on Alaska's North Slope. The first production well was produced in 1968. In 1972, there were some vegetation studies started, and in 1977, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, or TAPS, was completed, and that's when oil started flowing from the North Slope south. And by 1985, there was the first dedicated revegetation trials that were executed. And here's some pictures from some of those early trials, and you can see the grid network for monitoring and that sort of thing. And in the 1990s, that's when regular monitoring and reporting began on sites that had already graduated out of production or exploration in the oil field. So to give an overview of what I see as the important pieces for wetland restoration program management, the items that pop to the top is that you have to have good leadership of some sort. We need to manage good day-to-day operations of the program, address costs and efficiencies, have a long-term time scale, bring in expertise both in contractors and outside experts, make sure there's strong relationships amongst all the people involved, apply adaptive management, and make sure to include research in the program. I will move through each one of these as I go through in the slideshow and explain them a little further. So when it comes to leadership, I'd say that this program was developed and grew and thrived under the leadership of Bill Strever, who had the long-term vision and had a big picture view, made sure that the program fit into kind of a bigger picture of land management priorities, both for agencies and for the oil development companies. That he made sure that we used verified methodologies in our monitoring and in our treatments of these wetland restoration sites. He encouraged collaboration across the board between contractors and with agency personnel, and making sure that it was encouraged and fostered. He prioritized research and trials both on these sites, made sure there was really good records maintenance, and also visited the field. That picture in the lower left shows him visiting a site so he himself could see what was going on the ground. So good leadership is a very key component to a wetland restoration program. So, and just to clarify, when it comes to wetland restoration activities, anyone who's dealt with wetland restoration knows that it's not a moneymaker for the people you're working for. It usually costs people money to do wetland restoration, and it's usually under some sort of compliance obligation that drives why people want to have their wetland restored. And it can be difficult sometimes as a practitioner to justify costs, upfront costs for long-term benefits, but it's good to take one of those long short-term picture views to think about in the long run and explain that to your clients about how short-term payments can have long-term benefits. So I'm going to jump ahead in my list to outside expertise. Oh, wait, maybe those moves are not the experts we were looking for. Instead, we're actually looking for people who might be able to lend some outside expertise. And one of the great things about this program is not only do we have many different contractors participating in the program, but also Bill Strever made sure to bring in a panel of experts to review the program as a whole, basically do a type of an audit to look at it. It was an expert review of all the work that we did. So looking at our day-to-day maintenance and all the other things I talked about in the program management considerations to make sure that we were doing a good job. And fortunately, they agreed that this is one of the best wetland restoration programs they've ever seen in the way that it's run and the way that it's executed and how the work is going on the ground. So in day-to-day operations, when it comes to project planning, there's many different ways to track what it is that you're doing. And this is just an example of one way to track a program is to have a spreadsheet. And you can have all the information you want to have on the spreadsheet, and the green boxes are showing when the sites need to be visited and when different contractors need to go to places. And this is one way to do it, but there's got to be some method, whether it's a database or a spreadsheet or some other tracking system, but something that all people can access and look at and make sure that everything is on track. It's important to have all the information in one location. And then when it comes to compliance tracking, it's good to have a way to summarize the data that's been, what treatments have been applied and what monitoring has been completed and what have been the findings of the monitoring. And so these sheets were produced in order to show for each site what it was that's been done, a timeline, what the compliance obligations are, the performance standards, and what activities have been performed. It's also important to make sure that this information is accessible to others. And so there was a disc that was made that included all the reports, all these summary sheets, and an interactive map where you could click on different sites in order to access information from each site. This made sure that all the records were in one location and they were electronic, which makes it really easy. And this information is shared with all involved parties. So all the contractors and all the agencies have a record of this on a DVD that they can use to look at all the information. And this way of keeping everything in one place and sharing it with all the involved parties helps greatly with managing the program and communication with everybody involved. And just to know, of course, in Alaska, we have a very strong seasonality to our work. We have the summer season, which is very short and intense. And then in winter, when it looks like this, that's when we're doing a lot of our compliance tracking and paperwork type work. Then there's the management of field activities. So it's good to have a dedicated person who can help with the day-to-day field activities, somebody who's back in the office who can make phone calls and arrangements and discuss with other people about permissions or parking or whatever it might be, flights and such. And that's important to have as well. And then, of course, management of reporting, making sure all the reports are produced of high quality, that they're reviewed, and that they're submitted to the appropriate agencies and on time. So when it comes to costs and efficiencies, one of the things that's really helpful when it comes to creating efficiencies and cost reductions is having lots of guidance documents. So this document was created and then revised that shows, it gives guidance on how to treat different sites for this particular region, and it gives some guidance. It's not a prescriptive document, but it does help contractors who are entering the program understand what should be done. And the fact that it was revised was important because it updated some things in there that people had learned over time. So then there's guidance on how to use repeat photography and how to test soil, if you're going to test soil, like how it should be done. And then other research and papers that on how to do the monitoring and execute it well so that it's streamlined across all the contractors, and then to update it and readdress it over the years and make sure that it's up to date with the latest information and the best information, and it's collaborated amongst the different contractors, and so the contractors are doing things in the same way so that when you compare data, you're comparing apples to apples. So then when it comes to applied research, this can also help with costs and efficiencies because you can have learning moments. So the picture in the upper right where I'm standing in a field of purple flowers, this was an experiment about seeding a site where the gravel was not removed. And then there's also been tests on soil quality, which revealed over time that a lot of times the soil is pretty similar across sites in this particular region. And making sure that the practices we're doing have long-term success. And then also coming up with innovative ways to address sites can help in the applied research. So time is really important. A time scale, most restoration sites take at least 10 years of monitoring, sometimes less, sometimes more. The system that's set up has to accommodate this long-term vision, long-term monitoring periods, and which could be a decade or more. And the records need to be maintained in such a way so that if personnel changes, new people can come in and continue the work without there being a hole in understanding or application. And just to explain the picture in the lower left, that's a site that's been under restoration for about 10 years. And this is why it's tundra rehabilitation and not necessarily restoration, because it doesn't exactly mirror what the native tundra looks like, but it is well vegetated and looking healthy. So when it comes to expertise, one of the things that's brought in is also has to do with contractor collaboration. So there are some people like this woman here, Janet Kidd, who has decades of experience doing this kind of work. And as part of the program leadership, I was sent out with her to learn from her, even though she worked for a different company that I did, to learn how they performed the work in the field. Which I think having that sharing across contractors is really important. It's unusual as well, but it made the program much stronger. It's similar to, as I like to say, it's recipe sharing instead of having a secret recipe. And so instead of hoarding your secrets, you share them, and it makes everybody stronger, even though some people are still not going to put cilantro in their food because they just don't like it. So each person has to address each site individually, but it does help to share our information across the board and to work together on occasion in the field. So then another part of it with contractor collaboration that also helps the program leadership is that we would often review each other's reports. And so that not only alleviated leadership of the duties of doing all of the reviews, but it helped the contractors strengthen our own work because we could see what each other was doing and give comments and discuss things and approaches to make all of us stronger. And then another part of the expertise and collaboration is hosting a meeting with agency personnel to make sure that they feel like they know what's going on and understand. And that's part of developing these strong relationships. So you have relationships amongst contractors and you have relationships with agency personnel. And one of the things that we do is make sure to bring agency personnel into the field with us. And here is a demonstration. Sue Bishop is showing how the vegetation monitoring is performed so that when the agency personnel are looking at the reports, they understand what it is that they're seeing. We would take them to many different example sites, new sites, young sites, old sites, sites that were thriving, and then sites that were struggling, so that the agency personnel can understand what works, what doesn't, where do we have a good understanding of what applies, and where we're still struggling to understand what we should do to help a site. We'd also hold a meeting in town with agency personnel, and the contractors would give presentations to discuss various approaches and different sites that they've worked on to explain to the agency people what is going on in the field so they understand. And usually we'd hold a meeting first and then we'd go visit the field. And then the other part that I thought was a really great move is that the contractors have open freedom to talk to agency personnel at any time, whether it's to ask questions or to discuss sites, but also to discuss any problems that we felt like we saw as individual citizens, which gave us strength to feel like we were empowered to do our work the best way possible. So when it comes to adaptive management, here's a picture of September 15th, and I know some people like Kimberly down in Florida, this might seem shocking that there'd be so much snow on the ground on September 15th, but things like this happen when we planned a helicopter trip out to a remote site, which takes a lot of logistics and it's very expensive, and that day it happened to snow 2 inches. And we still went out, we did our work as best we could, and we discussed it prior to and decided whether or not we thought it was going to work or not, but just addressing problems as they come up. And this is a theme across any wetland restoration, and I know Matt's going to talk a little bit about it as well. Some of the issues that we find at our site is that places that we fertilize, sometimes the only thing that grows is moss, and then at other sites we have great growth of vegetation, of the vascular vegetation, but it gets heavily grazed by animals. And so one of the adaptive management techniques we've used is wildlife exclusion fences to allow the sites to grow up more fully. And then there's other challenges that require creative solutions. So in research and trials, we have some challenges. One of the challenges we found was that these trenches that were dug sometimes filled with water. The review panel, actually the expert review panel, came up with the idea of using pre-vegetated mats to help prevent the migration of water and the thawing of the soil underneath. We performed a rather expensive but effective trial and hope to be able to do some more of this work in the future. And then the next part of research and trials, of course, is documentation. And so being encouraging and paying for contractors to write up their results, both for research and for monitoring. And then encouraging graduate students as well to participate. So there was one graduate student who did a study on germination of carrot seed, found a way to do it, and amazingly, that graduate student ended up becoming an agency representative, which is kind of an ironic twist. So last few things, when it comes to site inspections and work checkups, just don't be afraid to acknowledge problems. Here we had a site where throughout the winter, an adjacent pad, all the snow had been plowed onto our restoration site. They didn't know, we communicated with them, and we said we need to push the snow elsewhere. But it's to look at it and say, okay, we've got this issue, also to talk to the agencies about it and be very upfront and open about problems that arise when they arise. It definitely strengthens the program in the long run and can make the whole entire system work better. So to review, the program management considerations, strong leadership is really important. Managing the day-to-day operations, all the small tracking and data management. Looking at costs and efficiencies that can be performed, even if it's a cost up front for a long-term gain. Making sure that the program addresses long-term vision, that you bring in experts, both in contractors but also outside experts to look at your program. Encourage and develop strong relationships amongst contractors and with agency personnel. Apply adaptive management and perform research as part of the program, which will help make the program more efficient in the long run. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Matt.
Thank you, Lorraine. I think I've got what I need here. Lorraine provided this sort of broader program perspective, and I'm going to give more of a project-specific perspective, a little more detail on certain aspects, but you're going to hear several common themes, as Lorraine mentioned at the start of her talk. So let me jump in here, but before I do, let me thank everyone for joining us online. I want to thank Lorraine specifically for doing this today with me. I want to thank Kim for all her help and SWS for the opportunity. There are other people who helped contribute to some of what you'll see today and here. I'm not going to provide names, but I want to make sure folks understand this is not specifically solely my thoughts and my language, if you will. Most of it is, but not solely. So let's see. Whoop. So start with, hey. There we go. I'll start with what I call a simplified hierarchy, which you pretty much have to consider for any kind of restoration project that you're dealing with, which is watershed, landscape position, hydrologic regime and connections, and soils. And when you consider all of those, they lead to objectives or target hydrologic regime and connections, soil composition, plant communities, and sometimes specific species, and by extension, fauna. Lots of different kinds of wildlife. The goal here is a sustainable hydrologic regime and connections. And connections are important when you're dealing with a particular restoration project. If you don't understand the hydrologic regime and the connections that exist and what needs to be restored, then you're not ready to go any further in your planning. So you've got to understand seasonal fluctuations. You have to understand tidal ranges and frequencies when you're dealing with coastal situations. And in many cases, salinity content when you're on the coast and in places out in the arid West as well. And you've got to understand the temperature regime and the predicted effects of climate change that you're going to be dealing with long term. You can see some of the pictures here in the lower left in Louisiana where I've worked. Obviously cypress knees, some water, hydrology in a soil pit, in peat actually there. The dune picture is the coast of Georgia, a project I've been working on for a while. And then in New England, again on the lower right, in a sort of run-of-the-mill red maple swamp where there are vernal pools that had to be restored. So what's the combination that you're looking for? And if I could spin the dial, I'd give you that combination, but I can't. So we'll have to run through the rest of the slides and figure that one out. So the first thing you have to really understand, and all of this is kind of regardless of whether you are reviewing a plan or you are trying to produce a restoration plan, all of these considerations and factors are relevant. So you want to be able to look at and analyze your impact site or your reference site. And when I say impact, I don't necessarily mean an area that was somehow disturbed or filled illegally without the benefit of a permit. It could just be a site that was disturbed in the past and obviously needs some restoration work, or to use Lorraine's term, some rehabilitation work as well. So you've got to understand your impact site, and hopefully, if you can find it, a reference site or sites, and use those as your guides. Now, there are a lot of cautions about the disturbances at impact sites, and you have to understand to the greatest degree you can the history of that area and what's gone on and what's been disturbed, so that you can fully really comprehend what it is you're looking at and why. And you may, as it says, you may need sampling data, probably will need sampling data to analyze for appropriate constituents and ranges, or in some cases, contaminants and concentrations. I've done a fair amount of work at restoring wetlands on hazardous waste sites, Superfund sites, and the sampling, for any of you who've done that, who've worked at sites like that, the sampling is robust, which is maybe an understatement. It's a very long-term thing. So you're looking at your guides, your impact and reference sites, and you're trying to figure out what kinds of soils you may need and what kinds of plants. And so you're going to need some data to compare to the impact site and or the reference site. That comes from sampling. And you want to take note of the location of sources of both soils and plants, from a surrounding land use aspect for disturbances there and invasive species. And you want to look at and think about transport distance, particularly for soils, whether things have to be stored and for how long and where they can be stored. And although often plants are purchased from nurseries, to the greatest degree possible, if you can get plants from a donor site, and there are a couple of different scenarios where that's possible and a smart thing to do, there can be also cautions to deal with. So keep that in mind. When talking about hydrologic regime and connections, you've got to have monitoring data, absolute must. And the longer the better. I've worked on sites where you have a year's worth of data, which is really not sufficient, but there can be external pressures that cause you to have to make decisions on the best information you've been able to obtain, and just kind of go with it. And that comes into play in a little bit in terms of what the risks are with doing that. But the longer you can have hydrologic monitoring data for a particular site or sites, the better. And you're really focusing on frequency and duration, and seasonality. Now, those are the key aspects or factors you want to consider. But nowadays, of course, we also have to take into account the expectations of climate change, and the predictions that you're dealing with. Sea level rise, obviously, anywhere along the coast, you've got to consider. And both storm frequency and severity, we've just seen here on the East Coast, down in the Southeast, and even up into New England the other day, we had some fairly severe storms. Even for New England the other day, we had about 5 inches of rain in less than a day, which created a whole variety of flooding. Now, that's not a lot by comparison to the Southeast and other parts of the country, but it is up here, particularly where you've got an extremely built environment, and a lot of things can flood. If you look at the picture on this slide down below, it's a good example of hydrologic regime and connections. This is a conceptual design that I helped work on for restoring an area. Trying to think how to mention this without revealing the project. It was a natural gas exploration and extraction area, and that pond you see in the middle was a fracking pond. And we were trying to disconnect it and restore it, and reconnect the stream, the white line and the orange line here, to restore the hydrology and the connections and the wetland down below on the left to the pond. Soils, the next thing. So obviously, again, you're going to try to begin with an impact site. if that's what you're dealing with restoring, or a reference site if you can find one, an appropriate one. And you have to realize, of course, that you cannot reproduce the soils at the impact site, or certainly not at a reference site. But the intent here is really to install the right ingredients so that over time, the soils will develop into the kind of profile that you're hoping to get. Texture, organic and mineral content, very important. And just a concern, I've dealt with a couple of, well, both regulatory agencies at federal and state levels and consultants and contractors, where there's this desire to add lots and lots of organic matter, and not realizing that, as this says, typically no more than 30% of added organic matter is going to be retained as soil OM over the course of time. A lot of things happen to it. It gets transported from the site. It gets used by life processes of both plants and animals living there. It can burn off in warmer weather if it's exposed to air and to higher temperatures. So those kinds of things you want to keep in mind. Here, at least in the East, compost, fine wood, or leaf waste tend to work well as an additive for organic matter. And I think Lorraine mentioned this earlier, always a concern when dealing with restoring soils is to avoid or minimize to the greatest degree compaction, because that's going to affect the rooting of your plants and the permeability of the soil. If it's available and suitable, try to salvage soil from an impact site if there's a site you know that's going to be disturbed. But if you're going to take whole sections and root mass, beware of contaminants, salinity, possibly here in the east or across the north of the 48 states, from road salt, and certainly invasive species. So those things have to be sometimes sampled and checked. Plants. Again, hopefully you have either an impact site and a reference site, and you're going to use those as your guide, and you're going to take note of certain things. Target vertical and horizontal structure that you're trying to restore, both dominant and non-dominant species, natives and exotics versus, natives versus exotics and invasives, and mosaic and patchiness of a reference area and any microtopographic relief that you hopefully can reproduce on your restoration site. And also, and important, are any stressors that you believe would be present at your restoration area that you're going to have to account for and monitor and beware of. So all these things are important when dealing with plants. You can see on the lower left a little bit of microtopographic relief in that long linear restoration area there, and just a couple of other pretty pictures of plants from around places where I've worked before. So what is reference and why does it matter? And I want to give credit here to a gentleman named Eric Stein from California. These are mostly his ideas from a webinar that we did previously a few months back. But what is reference and why does it matter? Well, reference provides a template or an anchor point to guide your restoration activities. Reference has got to reflect a comparable landscape connection, and that's both physical connection, hydrologic connection, both combined, very important. Don't define reference based on biology, and I've seen this a few times, but don't ignore it either. Reference is really going to be based on hydrology and physical processes and connections that exist in a particular area. The biology will follow in most cases if you get those things correct. Don't worry about pristine. You see that a lot in terms of reference standard. It's often not appropriate at all, and you're probably not going to find it, at least not in the East. Particularly here in New England, nothing is pristine, or probably less than 1% of the landscape. And so you're going to deviate from reference standard because that's probably going to be the most appropriate restoration target that you're going to be able to achieve. As it says in the italics bullet at the bottom, you've got to look at all these different things and determine the most appropriate reference condition given the objectives and the limitations of the restoration site and project. So that's a lot to consider and take into account, but you've got to do that. Look for opportunities to restore habitat mosaics when you're doing restoration, and assuming this is appropriate, but it's a good objective to bear in mind when you're doing that. And you can see in the diagram or the figure on the left, all the different colored areas. Those are different habitats being restored here. Some of this is tidal, nearer the water. Some of it is obviously not tidal, but you can see some of the disturbed areas, and they're targeted for restoration to different cover types or habitat types. Monitoring, corrective action, adaptive management, from the very initial planning to the final design to construction, you should be crafting or thinking about and revising, refining a monitoring plan. Sometimes that gets left to the very end of the process. It should be a part from the very beginning. It might not be a large part, but it should be a part. And despite the most thoughtful planning and implementation, it happens. So you've got to develop options for corrective action depending upon what could go wrong. And some problems are more predictable than others. And this is kind of a quasi-risk analysis. As you've gone through all of your design and planning, again, you should be thinking about monitoring and about adaptive management and what could be done should certain things go wrong. And sometimes the most important part of adaptive management is the process that you put in place to consider cause and response. And that can be critical. So restoration takes time. And I saw this quote and I don't remember where. I wish I could provide attribution, but I can't. But it really sums up a lot. I know I've been here and thought these things. Keep in mind that most plant communities take longer than the typical 5 to 10 year monitoring period that you see sort of routinely now. Shrub and forested wetlands probably take longer than 20 years, especially if the hydrology is a challenging aspect of your project. Conditions will naturally fluctuate over time and in response to episodic events. And you've got to focus on long-term trajectory of site conditions. So couple long-term monitoring at restoration sites with regional reference sites, if they're available, in order to assess whether you're on the right trajectory for your project. What should you be thinking about? Again, historical, and this is from the beginning to the end. What's the historical condition prior to some major disturbance, if you can determine what that is, in addition to what's my historical degraded condition. So what happened and what is my degraded condition now, so I can understand, or better understand, what needs to be fixed, if you will. Diagram your hydrologic processes if you can do that. Also document hydrologic impacts. If you're dealing with coastal systems, in river openings, determine mouth dynamics for a river entry into a bay or an estuary. Try to determine the history and frequency of large reset events in a particular area in case they may occur, and to try and figure out how likely such events may occur. And again, expected future changes to hydrology from climate change induced alterations. And if you can figure out current soil conditions at your site, and if it's possible historic, that will give you some better guidance on dealing with these soil factors below: compaction, salinity, organic matter, duration of inundation, and or saturation. Biological connections are very important, and I'm going to go quickly here just because we're getting close on time. But the last bullet, if possible, and you have the ability to do this, get a third party, an independent review, to QA/QC the plan. And even if they can be brought on board throughout, from beginning all the way to construction, it's great to have a third party, an independent review, because you can't think of everything. Even a team of people can't think of everything. And it's great to have that kind of independent set of eyes looking at this. And just remember these things. I'm not going to go through them. You can read what they are, but they're cautions about all plans and things to keep in mind. And the very last one, embrace adaptive restoration and take the long view, and be like a doctor, have patience. You have to have patience. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Lorene and Matt. I really appreciate your presentations, and we're pretty good on time. We have about 9 or 10 minutes left for questions. So I'm going to be reading the questions from the participants that I've received through the questions pane to the presenters, and I've got a couple of my own. Also, if you forgot to ask a question, you can go ahead and type it in now, or you can email either Lorene or Matt at the email addresses here at the bottom of their photographs. And you can also go ahead and do that and email them for those questions. So if you view the recorded webinar later, you can also do the same thing. So I believe that their emails won't change in the meantime. So let's go ahead and get started with our questions. I want to go ahead and ask Matt one, just because he just got done and I'm still thinking about it. I want to know, I think you talked about, I know you talked about monitoring hydrology and how important that is, especially for a wetland. It's the major driving force for wetlands. So how long do we need to monitor? What's enough data? It probably varies for site, but is, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? How much is enough?
The $64 question for sure. There's no set answer. It really depends on the project site, and I'll use these terms in a sort of relative fashion, how simple or complicated the site is, how large, the different complexities you have to deal with in terms of landscape position. I try to push for at least 2 years. Ideally, I would say, if it's possible, 3 to 5, but sometimes circumstances dictate that you've got to go with, let's say, a max of a year. And I've been stuck with that and had to make decisions based on a year. And I think the place you can take that into consideration then is in your sort of risk analysis for what could go wrong in your adaptive management plan.
Okay, thanks. I do have a question for both of you. It's what kind of considerations should we make for rehabilitation restoration on a hazardous site, keeping in mind the redox regime can mobilize some contaminants? So Lorene, do you want to address that, or Matt, or both of you?
I think Matt, you should address that one. I don't generally deal with contaminated sites.
Okay. Well, again, no set answer. It really depends on what kind of contamination you're dealing with and what the levels of contamination are. Sometimes things can be really complicated. There's a whole bunch of factors that go into that. Yeah, I'm trying to think. You really need to understand what you're dealing with for contaminants and concentrations and the hydrologic regime at a site, flow paths, what the seasonality is, frequency and duration, all those things you've got to understand before you can jump to the factors that you're talking about here, Kim. When you're dealing with contaminants, hazardous waste and sites, that's just a sort of a tenfold increase in complexity for wetlands. And it's going to take longer. Typically, you're going to have to bring in greater and more varied expertise to deal with it, particularly if you're talking about some what I'd call non-routine contaminants. I think that's about the best I can say.
Okay. Well, I have a question that is somewhat similar to one of our participants, and it's about, both of you have seemed to have benefited from information sharing between different sectors of wetland restoration groups, and one of the things that I asked is how do you do that most effectively, but someone also asked about how you engage with the local communities to pass on information, I guess all the stakeholders, to pass on information and also obtain local knowledge of the restoration areas or rehabilitation areas.
Lorraine?
Yeah, well, so some wetlands work I've done in another part of Alaska. I mean, obviously, the program that I just talked about is completely isolated from any community, so it's not applicable there. But in other places that I've worked, engaging with the community, some of the ways that I've done it, and I'm not necessarily the expert on this, and I think it's something that people are talking a lot about as community engagement. But first off is having some kind of sign. Have some sign placed at your restoration site that lets people know that it's a restoration site. And if you have the money or ability to do some kind of interpretive sign, that can be especially helpful so people understand what you've done and why you've done it and what you're aiming for and what they're looking at. And then in addition to that, you can offer tours sometimes of your sites. It depends on the site, of course, and how accessible it is and who owns the land. And then also giving talks. I think it's really important to reach out to the community and find avenues in order to be able to share information about what you've done, and whether it's at community-type organizations, city councils or that kind of thing, or if it's through particular groups, local groups, even the Chamber of Commerce or that sort of thing. It's good for people to know and understand a lot of people don't even understand why wetlands are important. Most people think they're just mosquito breeding grounds. So it's good to share why it's important and just prepare talks that are very simple with lots of good images, very few words, and talk to the people like you're just talking to friends.
I do have a couple of logistic questions about doing some of the rehabilitation and the restoration. One of them is, do you have any experience with restoration on granular fill, and then have any advice for that? And the other is, do you recommend seeding over natural recruitment of plants? So one was about granular fill, and the other one was about seeding over natural recruitment.
Well, Matt, I'd be happy to deal with the seeding versus natural recruitment, but I don't know about the granular fill part.
Well, I was going to ask Kim, what do you mean exactly by granular fill?
Well, I will have to ask our participant, if they're still on the line, if they can go ahead and qualify that or clarify what they mean by granular fill or granular fill.
Right.
So hopefully they'll hear that. But I mean, in the meantime, maybe Lorene can talk about the seeding over natural recruitment.
Similar to what Matt's been saying and what he answered in some of the other questions is it's really dependent on the site that you're working with. And so, and also it has a lot to do with the size of the site and the type of vegetation in the surrounding area. So in my thinking, if I am going to plan restoration, I will first try to see if there's a way to only do natural recruitment and avoid seeding. If that is possible, and that has to do with site size, it's got to be a small enough site that seed can get into the site or vegetation can colonize, and also has to do with the soil and the hydrology and the surrounding vegetation versus what you have to work with at your restoration site. If you can do natural recruitment only, I would say go for it. But sometimes there's sites where that's just not possible, whether it's too big or the soil's too poor or you've got the wrong kind of hydrology. And then you need to seed. And ideally, you'll seed with a type of seed that is from the local area and grown weed-free.
I do have a clarification on that question about granular fill. Basically, that is oil and gas line that has proposed gravel as a work pad along the right-of-way. They want to leave it in place and restore it. So I guess they have the gravel that they're trying to leave the gravel there and replace it.
I guess I'd say you really can't, if you're dealing with gravel in some sort of transmission line or whatever, or for an extraction pad, I'd say you can't restore that to anything other than a granular fill pad. I mean, if we're talking about removing it, that's another matter entirely. Sure, it can be removed, and then you've got to deal with compaction underneath and whether former soils were excavated or scraped off before the granular fill pad was put in. Whole lot of different factors to consider there, but from a general standpoint, I mean, as you saw in some of Lorene's pictures, granular fill, crushed stone, rock, whatever it happens to be, that can be removed and restored. It just takes time and money and a lot of forethought.
And we've had some success rehabilitating sites with gravel left in place, but generally speaking, you're not going to have wetland conditions. You're going to have upland conditions, and it's going to require different vegetation.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think it's a little bit after 2. I'm going to just ask a couple more questions on here, and then we'll conclude our webinar with a couple of announcements. One of the questions is, and this one is for Lorene, is the North Slope important waterfowl habitat in the summer? It certainly looks like it would be.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a very rich wildlife waterfowl habitat. Yes, indeed.
Mm-hmm. And then the other one will go all the way to the southeast U.S. coastal plain. And the question is about restoration of wetland hydrology on former agricultural sites. Is it better to provide ditch plugs that are small in size, and you don't have to bring in a lot of fill for those things, or to refill the entire ditch? What are your feelings on that? Perhaps, Matt, you've done some work in at least Louisiana, maybe in the southeast as well.
Yeah, again, there are site-specific considerations you have to deal with in terms of slope, soil type, what kind of hydrologic regime you're trying to restore there, if you know what was previously, and very often you do have reference sites you can go to figure those things out. But you know, I guess my take on things is that less is more if less is possible, if you will. And so if you can simply put in small plugs rather than fill entire ditches, probably better. Not always, but probably. But it really does depend on the site and what it is, what kind of habitat or wetland you're trying to restore.
Right, right. Well, I think that if anyone else has questions, they can email you. I want to definitely thank both of our speakers today. Before we go, I just want to make a couple of announcements. Matt, I'm not sure if you still have control, but if you could move to the next slide, please. I got there we go. Our next webinar is going to be in October, held by or presented by Nick Davidson and Rob McGinnis, talking about the Ramsar Convention and the Society of Wetland Scientists. So I hope to see you there. And if you go to the next slide, one of the things I want to make you aware of is that the Society of Wetland Scientists is engaging, or we have a Wetland Ambassadors Graduate Research Fellowship Program that's in our second year. And this year we have two young ladies that are doing their graduate fellowships from Mexico and India. We have Tatiana from Mexico and Arohi from India. And they're working with mentors in the U.S. and in Canada. So these students are supported by a grant from SWS, and we just started our very first crowdfunding campaign to raise more funds for this program and for our wetland ambassadors. So if you consider donating any amount, you can see we're only about 1/10 of the way to our goal of $2,000. You just go to the SWS webpage and do the awards and grants drop-down menu to help support these wetland ambassadors from developing countries, kind of have a working wetland experience and further our reach about wetlands education throughout the globally. So with that, I want to again thank Laureen Lynn and Matt Schweisberg for taking the time out of your busy schedules. I know Laureen just got back from an adventure, and so I really do appreciate you making the time to present this SWS webinar. And also thanks to you, the participants, for being in our audience today and asking some really good questions. And with that, I will thank you for attending and say goodbye until October. And hopefully some of our non-members will return in December for our next free quarterly webinar. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.